Chapter 1: Introduction to Wealth and Legacy. This opening chapter introduces Elizabeth Bigley, who transforms herself into Cassie Chadwick, the most audacious con artist of the Gilded Age. Born into poverty in 1857 Ontario, Elizabeth possessed an extraordinary gift for deception and an insatiable hunger for the glittering world of America's elite. The chapter explores her early years of petty fraud, her marriage to Dr. Leroy Chadwick, and her calculated entry into Cleveland's high society. Through vivid descriptions of the opulent mansions along Euclid Avenue, elaborate dinner parties, and the intoxicating atmosphere of wealth that defined the era, we witness Elizabeth's metamorphosis into Cassie Chadwick. The narrative establishes the stark contrast between her humble origins and her manufactured identity as a woman of distinguished breeding and mysterious wealth. As Cassie begins weaving her web of lies, subtle hints emerge of the fragile foundation upon which her empire rests. The chapter poses a haunting question about the nature of identity and legitimacy in a society obsessed with appearances. The stage is set for a tale of ambition, deception, and the dangerous allure of wealth that exists just beyond one's reach. The rain that fell on Cleveland that autumn evening did not distinguish between the mansions on Euclid Avenue and the modest homes scattered throughout the city. It slicked the cobblestones, softened the horse dung, and turned the air to cold gray gauze. Yet inside the carriages rolling toward the wide-fronted homes of the city's new industrial aristocracy, no one felt the damp. Plush interiors insulated fortunes, and fortunes insulated consciences. In the drawing room of a sprawling Victorian mansion, Cassie Chadwick adjusted the lace collar of her evening gown, her fingers tracing the cold, reassuring weight of a pearl necklace. The room was a suffocating embrace of velvet drapes and mahogany furniture, every surface gleaming with the patina of wealth. She was not a classic beauty, but she possessed a gravity that pulled people into her orbit. Her eyes, dark and assessing, held the peculiar shine of someone who knows something the rest of the world does not. Born Elizabeth Bigley in the unremarkable town of Eastwood, Ontario, in 1857, she had entered the world with nothing that could be weighed on a scale, but everything that mattered in a world obsessed with appearances. Her father was a railroad worker, her mother a washerwoman, and their modest home stood in stark contrast to the marble palaces she would one day inhabit. But Elizabeth possessed something her siblings did not. She could lie with the conviction of truth itself, and she understood instinctively that in America, perception was reality. Her early years were marked by small deceptions that served as rehearsals for grander performances. At 14, she forged her first check. At 22, she posed as a clairvoyant, bilking the grieving and desperate of their savings. Each arrest, each narrow escape taught her valuable lessons about human nature and the particular blindness that afflicts those who desperately want to believe. The transformation began in earnest when she married Dr. Leroy Chadwick in 1897. He was a respected physician in Cleveland, a man of modest wealth and impeccable reputation. For Elizabeth, he was a doorway into a world she had only glimpsed through windows. She became Cassie Chadwick, shedding her past like a snake sheds its skin. She studied the mannerisms of the wealthy with scientific precision, the way they held their teacups, the particular rhythm of their speech, which topics were discussed at dinner parties, and which were considered vulgar. Cleveland in the 1890s was a city intoxicated by its own prosperity. Oil barons and steel magnates built mansions along Euclid Avenue, each trying to outdo the other in displays of wealth. The newly rich craved the validation of old money, while old money sought to maintain its exclusive grip on social power. Into this delicate ecosystem walked Cassie Chadwick, and she understood immediately how to exploit its contradictions. Wealth, she discovered, was less about possession than performance. On Euclid Avenue, even the trees performed, their branches trimmed into obedient shapes. Children were walked, not allowed to run. Wives were escorted, not permitted to wander. Servants opened doors before hands reached for knobs. as if anticipating thoughts before they formed. She began modestly, dropping hints about a distinguished family back east, about inheritances and trusts. She dressed impeccably, but not ostentatiously, understanding that true wealth whispered rather than shouted. She hosted intimate dinner parties where the food was exquisite and the conversation carefully orchestrated. She donated to charities with calculated generosity, ensuring her name appeared in society pages alongside the city's most prominent families. The mansion she and Dr. Chadwick occupied became a showcase of her invented identity. Persian rugs covered the floors, oil paintings adorned the walls, and every object spoke of taste and fortune. Visitors marveled at the collection of rare books, the imported furniture, the sense that money was no object. What they did not know was that much of it was purchased on credit, that the foundation of this temple to wealth was built on promises and postponed payments. In the quiet moments when guests had departed and servants had retired, Cassie would stand at her bedroom window overlooking the avenue. The gas lamps cast pools of light on the cobblestones, and in the distance she could see the mansions of the Rockefellers, the Hannes, the Mathers. They had been born to this world. She had clawed her way into it. Names mattered, she realized. Some names were keys, others were locks. Hers, at the moment, was neither. But what if a name was not something you were given, but something you chose? The thought seemed almost obscene, like putting on a stranger's wedding ring. Yet the more she turned it over, the more reasonable it felt. As she blew out the lamp that evening, one name floated in the darkness like a promise. Carnegie. If a single surname could command the faith of the richest bankers in the world, what might happen if she learned to wear it better than they did? Chapter 2. The Rise and the Initial Struggles. This chapter chronicles Cassie's brilliant and dangerous gambit, claiming to be the secret illegitimate daughter of steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. Through a carefully orchestrated performance in New York, involving a mysterious visit to Carnegie's mansion and a forged promissory note for millions, Cassie convinces Cleveland banker Erie Reynolds of her extraordinary inheritance. The chapter details how she parlayed this single deception into a cascade of loans from multiple banks, each believing they held securities backed by Carnegie's vast fortune. As money pours in, Cassie lives with unprecedented extravagance, hosting lavish parties and making ostentatious purchases that only reinforce her fabricated identity. However, the mounting pressure of maintaining the lie becomes evident, the constant need for new loans to pay old debts, and the growing complexity of her financial house of cards. Personal tensions emerge as Dr. Chadwick grows uneasy with his wife's increasingly reckless spending, and Cassie finds herself trapped in a cycle where stopping would mean exposure. The chapter explores the psychology of the con artist who becomes trapped by her own success, ending with the chilling realization that she has become so successful at being Cassie Chadwick that Elizabeth Bigley can never return. The carriage rolled to a stop before the imposing brownstone mansion at 2 East 981st Street. Cassie Chadwick stepped down onto the sidewalk, her heart hammering beneath her perfectly tailored traveling suit. Behind her, Erie Reynolds, the president of the Wade Park Banking Company, waited with barely concealed curiosity. She had brought him to New York for a specific purpose, and everything depended on the next hour. The Carnegie Mansion rose before them like a fortress of wealth and power. Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish immigrant who had become the richest man in America, lived here when he was not at his estate in Scotland. His steel empire had built him a fortune estimated at $400 million, a sum so vast it defied comprehension. And Cassie was about to claim she was his daughter. The lie had been germinating for months. She had studied Carnegie obsessively, learning every detail of his life, his habits, his known associates. She knew he was a private man, protective of his reputation, and unlikely to publicly address scandalous rumors about illegitimate children. This was the crack in the armor she intended to exploit. Cassie turned to Reynolds, her face a mask of nervous anticipation. This was a delicate family matter, she explained. Carnegie would be mortified if he knew she had brought a banker to his door. Reynolds, a man who had built his career on careful judgment, nodded and settled back into his seat. He watched as Cassie approached the mansion, spoke briefly to someone at the door, and disappeared inside. What Reynolds could not see was that Cassie had never entered the mansion at all. She had slipped through a side gate into the service entrance, where she waited in shadows for precisely 45 minutes. She had gambled that Reynolds would not follow, that his sense of propriety and desire to believe would keep him in the carriage. She was right. When she emerged, she carried a small leather satchel and wore an expression of profound emotion. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. She climbed back into the carriage without a word, clutching the satchel to her chest. Only later, in the privacy of Reynolds' hotel suite, did Cassie reveal what she claimed had transpired. She told him that Andrew Carnegie was indeed her father, the result of a youthful indiscretion. She said he had acknowledged her privately, but could never do so publicly without destroying his reputation. She claimed he had been supporting her secretly for years, and that he had just given her securities worth millions of dollars. Then, with trembling hands, she opened the satchel and showed Reynolds a promissory note for $5 million, bearing Carnegie's signature. The note was, of course, a forgery, one of several created by a skilled document forger in Cleveland. But Reynolds, staring at the elegant script and the staggering sum, saw only opportunity. If Cassie Chadwick was truly Carnegie's daughter, then lending her money against that collateral was not just safe, it was brilliant business. The loans began immediately. Reynolds advanced Cassie $200,000, secured, he believed, by her Carnegie inheritance. She spent it within weeks on a new mansion in Cleveland, jewelry that made society matrons gasp with envy, and parties where champagne flowed like water. With each display of wealth, her reputation grew more solid, more unassailable. But $200,000 was merely the beginning. Cassie took her forged securities to other banks, the Citizens National Bank, the National Bank of Oberlin, institutions in Pittsburgh, Boston, and New York. Each time, she told variations of the same story. Each time, bankers looked at the Carnegie name and saw only profit. Between 1901 and 1904, Cassie Chadwick borrowed nearly $2 million. The money sustained an illusion that had become indistinguishable from reality. Her home became a palace of excess with a staff of 20 servants. Her wardrobe contained hundreds of gowns, many worn only once. She traveled in private railway cars and stayed in the finest hotels. Society pages chronicled her every movement, and Cleveland's elite competed for invitations to her soirees. Yet beneath the glittering surface, cracks were beginning to show. Dr. Chadwick, initially dazzled by his wife's sudden wealth, grew increasingly uneasy. He questioned the source of the money, the wisdom of such extravagant spending. Cassie deflected his concerns with vague references to trusts and investments, but she could see doubt creeping into his eyes. More troubling still was the mathematics of her deception. The loans had to be serviced. Interest payments came due. Banks began asking when the principal would be repaid. Cassie's solution was always the same: borrow more. She took out new loans to pay the interest on old ones, creating a dizzying spiral of debt that required constant motion to sustain. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. Cassie began having trouble sleeping. She would lie awake calculating figures, planning the next loan, rehearsing the next performance. She took laudanum to calm her nerves, then cocaine to maintain her energy. The drugs helped, but they also made her reckless. In quiet moments, she would catch glimpses of Elizabeth Bigley in the mirror, the poor girl from Ontario, the small-time forger. The woman who had once been satisfied with a few $100 and temporary escape from poverty. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. There was no going back. Elizabeth Bigley was dead. Only Cassie Chadwick remained, and she had to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. The Major Setback or Crisis. The carefully constructed empire begins to crumble when Herbert Newton, a Boston banker, grows suspicious of Cassie's claims and launches a discreet investigation. This chapter details the mounting pressure as Newton discovers inconsistencies in her story and begins comparing notes with other banks that have loaned Cassie money. The crisis accelerates when the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, which has extended Cassie credit far beyond its capacity, faces a liquidity crisis and demands immediate repayment. Cassie attempts increasingly desperate measures to maintain her facade, forging additional documents, bribing bank officials, and trying to secure legitimate loans using her mansion as collateral. The chapter explores her psychological deterioration as the walls close in, her relationships fracture, and the very society that once embraced her begins to whisper doubts. Dr. Chadwick confronts her directly, demanding the truth, and she realizes that even her marriage has become another casualty of her ambition. The chapter culminates in a devastating moment when Cassie receives word that Andrew Carnegie himself has been contacted about her claims and has issued a public denial, stating unequivocally that he has no illegitimate children and knows nothing of Miss Chadwick or her alleged securities. The telegram arrived at 11 in the morning, delivered by a boy who did not know he carried a death sentence. Cassie took it from the silver tray with steady hands, though something in the messenger's nervous demeanor made her stomach clench. She waited until she was alone in her study before opening it, and when she read the words, the room seemed to tilt around her. The unraveling had begun weeks earlier with Herbert Newton, a meticulous banker from Boston's National Bank. Unlike the other bankers who had been dazzled by the Carnegie connection, Newton was cautious and methodical. He had loaned Cassie $190,000, but something about the transaction troubled him. The promissory notes she had shown him were impressive, but they lacked certain details he expected to see in documents of such magnitude. Newton began his investigation quietly. He wrote to other banks, asking if they had extended credit to Mrs. Chadwick. The responses alarmed him. The Citizens National Bank of Oberlin had loaned her nearly $500,000, an amount that represented a substantial portion of the bank's total capital. Banks in Pittsburgh, New York, and Chicago had also extended credit. When Newton compiled the figures, he realized that Cassie Chadwick claimed to possess Carnegie securities worth over $10 million. But Newton's most damning discovery came when he examined the financial records of the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin. The bank's president, Charles Beckwith, had become so convinced of Cassie's wealth that he had loaned her money far beyond prudent limits. The bank was now dangerously overextended, and rumors of its instability were beginning to spread. The crisis came to a head on a cold morning in October when Beckwith appeared at Cassie's door, his face gray with desperation. The bank examiners were coming, he told her. They would review the books and discover the extent of his loans to her. Unless she could provide immediate repayment or proof of her Carnegie securities, the bank would fail, and he would be ruined. Cassie tried every trick she knew. She forged additional documents, creating elaborate trust agreements and investment portfolios. She contacted lawyers, attempting to create legal structures that might delay investigation. She even approached other banks, hoping to secure new loans to pay off the old ones. But word of the investigation had spread, and doors that had once opened at her name now remained closed. Dr. Chadwick confronted her in the library of their mansion. He had suspected for months that something was wrong, but he had allowed himself to be placated by her explanations and his own desire to believe. Now, with investigators asking questions and newspapers beginning to print speculative stories, he demanded the truth. Cassie looked at her husband, this decent man who had given her legitimacy and respectability, and she considered lying one more time. But she was tired, so desperately tired of the constant performance. She told him there was no Carnegie inheritance. She told him the securities were forgeries. She told him that everything they owned was purchased with borrowed money that could never be repaid. She watched his face as he absorbed this information, saw the progression of emotions, disbelief, horror, betrayal, and finally, a kind of broken acceptance. He left the room without a word, and she knew their marriage, like everything else she had built, was over. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. Cassie had always possessed extraordinary self-control, but now she found herself unable to sleep, unable to eat. She would stand at her bedroom window for hours, watching the street for investigators. The laudanum and cocaine that had helped her maintain her energy became necessities just to function. The society that had once celebrated her now began to turn. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends made excuses when she called. She would see women she had entertained cross the street to avoid her. The whispers followed her everywhere. Cleveland's elite, who had been so eager to embrace the mysterious heiress, were equally eager to distance themselves from the suspected fraud. On November 20, 1904, Andrew Carnegie issued his public statement. Speaking through his secretary, he declared that he had never met Mrs. Chadwick, that he had no illegitimate children, and that any securities bearing his name in connection with her were forgeries. The statement was brief and devastating. It appeared in newspapers across the country, and with those few sentences, the last pillar supporting Cassie's empire crumbled. The Citizens National Bank of Oberlin failed the next day. Depositors who had entrusted their life savings to the institution found themselves ruined. Charles Beckwith suffered a mental breakdown and had to be institutionalized. Other banks that had loaned her money faced severe losses. Cassie sat in her study, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that had never truly been hers, and understood that her time had run out. The authorities were coming. Her lawyers had abandoned her. She was alone with the consequences of her ambition, and those consequences were about to consume her completely. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. This chapter chronicles Cassie's arrest, trial, and the complete disintegration of her carefully constructed identity. Federal marshals arrest her in New York on charges of conspiracy to defraud banks, and she is held without bail. The trial becomes a national sensation, with newspapers across America covering every detail of her audacious con. Cassie attempts to maintain her composure in court, but the weight of evidence is overwhelming: forged documents, testimony from dozens of defrauded bankers, and Carnegie's damning statement. The chapter delves into her psychological state as she faces the reality of her situation, examining how the woman who had convinced the world's richest bankers of an impossible lie now confronts the truth of her own deception. Her defense attorneys try various strategies, but nothing can overcome the mountain of evidence. The chapter also explores the public's reaction, the mixture of fascination and outrage, the way her story becomes a cautionary tale about greed and deception in the Gilded Age. During sentencing, a twist emerges when Cassie delivers a statement that reveals her true understanding of what she had accomplished. She had not merely stolen money, she had exposed the fundamental hypocrisy of a society that valued names and connections over character and truth. The federal marshals came at dawn, as if darkness might somehow soften the humiliation of arrest. Cassie was awake when they knocked, had been awake all night, sitting in her hotel room and watching the first light creep across the city she had once hoped to conquer. She dressed carefully for her arrest, choosing a black silk dress and a hat with a modest veil. If this was to be her final performance as Cassie Chadwick, she would at least look the part. The walk from the hotel gardener to the waiting carriage drew spectators to windows and doorways. Some watched with undisguised satisfaction, others with horrified fascination. This was the woman who had fooled them all, who had walked among America's elite as an equal when she was nothing but a common criminal. The arraignment was brief and brutal. The charges were read in flat, legal language that somehow made her crimes sound both more and less impressive than they had been. conspiracy to defraud national banks, forgery, false pretenses. Each charge carried years of imprisonment. The prosecutor argued that Mrs. Chadwick had demonstrated a pattern of deception and was likely to flee. The judge agreed. Cassie was remanded to custody immediately. The trial began in March 1905 and immediately became a national sensation. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco sent reporters to Cleveland. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to see the woman who had perpetrated one of the most audacious frauds in American history. Cassie Chadwick had become a symbol, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the gullibility of even the most sophisticated men. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They called banker after banker to testify about the loans they had extended, the securities they had been shown, the assurances Cassie had given. Herbert Newton took the stand and methodically detailed his investigation, presenting forged documents alongside genuine Carnegie signatures to demonstrate the fraud. Charles Beckwith, the ruined banker from Oberlin, testified from a wheelchair, his health broken by the scandal. Carnegie's secretary read his employer's statement into the record. The steel magnate himself did not attend the trial, considering it beneath his dignity. But his words carried immense weight. He had never met Mrs. Chadwick. He had no illegitimate children. The securities were complete fabrications. The courtroom fell silent as the statement was read. Her lawyers attempted various strategies. They suggested she had been manipulated by others, that she was a victim rather than a perpetrator. They hinted at mental illness, suggesting that she had suffered from delusions of grandeur. They called character witnesses who testified to her generosity and charm. But nothing could overcome the evidence. Cassie herself took the stand on the trial's final day. Her lawyers had advised against it, but she insisted. She wanted to speak, to explain, perhaps to justify what she had done. She wore a simple gray dress and no jewelry, presenting herself as a woman humbled by circumstance. But when she began to speak, something unexpected happened. Instead of the contrite confession her lawyers had coached her to deliver, Cassie began to tell a different kind of truth. She talked about growing up poor, about the particular kind of invisibility that poverty confers. She described watching wealthy women shop in stores where she could not afford to enter, seeing them treated with deference and respect simply because of their names and their money. She spoke about the discovery that had changed her life, that in America appearance was reality, that if you could convince people you were wealthy, you became wealthy in every way that mattered. She had not stolen from the poor, she pointed out. She had borrowed from banks that had money to spare, from men who were so eager to profit from her supposed Carnegie connection that they had abandoned all prudence. The courtroom was transfixed. This was not the apology they expected. This was something more dangerous, a critique of the very system that had enabled her fraud. Cassie pointed out that the bankers had never asked for proof because they did not want proof. They wanted to believe. They wanted to be associated with Carnegie's wealth. They had been willing accomplices in their own deception. She spoke for nearly an hour, and by the end, even the prosecutor seemed unsettled. Cassie had not denied her crimes. She had done something more subversive. She had explained them in a way that implicated everyone in the courtroom. She had held up a mirror to Gilded Age society and forced them to see their own reflection. The judge was not moved by her eloquence. He sentenced her to 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary, the maximum penalty. As the sentence was pronounced, Cassie stood perfectly still, her face composed. She had known this was coming, but she had accomplished something in that courtroom. She had told her story on her own terms, had refused to play the role of the penitent criminal. As she was led from the courtroom in chains, Cassie looked back one final time at the spectators, at the reporters scribbling in their notebooks, at the society women who had once competed for her friendship. She smiled, a small, enigmatic expression that would be described and analyzed in newspapers for weeks. It was the smile of a woman who had lost everything, but had somehow, impossibly, won. Chapter 5. Resolution and Final Reflection. The final chapter follows Cassie through her imprisonment and ultimate death, exploring the psychological and physical toll of incarceration. In the Ohio State Penitentiary, stripped of the trappings of wealth and identity she had spent years constructing, Cassie confronts the woman she truly was beneath the performance. The chapter examines her relationships with fellow prisoners, her declining health, and her reflections on the life she had lived. Through letters she writes but never sends, we gain insight into her understanding of her own story, not as a tale of simple greed, but as a complex exploration of identity, ambition, and the American dream's dark underbelly. The narrative explores how her case influenced banking regulations and fraud prevention, how her story became a cautionary tale taught in business schools. Cassie dies in prison in 1907, just 2 years into her sentence, her health destroyed by the stress of her trial and the harsh conditions of imprisonment. The chapter concludes with a meditation on the meaning of her life, examining whether she was a criminal, a victim, a revolutionary, or simply a woman who dared to claim a place in a world that would never have given it to her freely. Her final legacy remains a troubling question about the nature of wealth, identity, and truth in America. The prison doctor examined Cassie with professional detachment, his fingers pressing against her abdomen as she winced in pain. The diagnosis was clear even before he spoke: heart disease, kidney failure, complications from years of drug use, and the crushing stress of her trial and imprisonment. She was dying, and they both knew it. Cassie was 49 years old, but her body had aged decades in the 2 years since her conviction. Prison had stripped away every layer of the identity she had constructed. There was no silk here, no champagne, no admiring society. There was only the daily reality of confinement, the bland food, the rough clothes, the endless hours of monotony, broken only by the sounds of other women's suffering. Cassie had been assigned to the sewing room, spending her days stitching prison uniforms with hands that once wore diamond rings. Her fellow prisoners regarded her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They knew her story, everyone in America knew her story, and they could not reconcile the legendary con artist with the thin, gray woman who sat among them. Some avoided her, as if fraud might be contagious. Others sought her out, wanting to hear stories about the world of wealth and power she had briefly inhabited. In the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep would not come, Cassie wrote letters. She addressed them to Dr. Chadwick, to the bankers she had defrauded, to Andrew Carnegie himself, though she never sent any of them. These letters were not apologies but explanations, attempts to make sense of what she had done and why. In one letter to Carnegie, "Never sent," she wrote, "You were born to wealth, sir, and so you cannot understand what it means to be born to nothing. You believe your fortune is the result of your virtue and hard work, and perhaps it is, but it is also the result of opportunity, of being in the right place at the right time, of having the right connections and the right name. I created those things for myself. I manufactured the opportunity you were born into." The letters revealed a woman grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Had she been wrong to deceive the bankers? Yes, by any conventional moral standard. But had the bankers been innocent victims? She did not think so. They had been greedy, careless with other people's money, so eager to profit from her supposed Carnegie connection that they had abandoned all prudent judgment. The case had indeed changed banking practices. After Cassie's conviction, banks implemented stricter verification procedures for large loans. They began requiring more extensive documentation, independent confirmation of collateral, and regular audits. In a perverse way, Cassie had made the banking system more honest, had exposed vulnerabilities that might have been exploited by someone even more ruthless. But these practical outcomes did not address the deeper questions her life raised. Cassie had exposed something uncomfortable about Gilded Age America, that the wealthy were often no more deserving of their wealth than she had been, that the system was built on appearances and connections rather than merit, that the distance between legitimate and illegitimate fortune was often just a matter of who was willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Her health deteriorated rapidly in the summer of 1907. The prison doctor recommended she be transferred to a hospital, but the authorities denied the request. She was a convicted felon, and she would serve her sentence regardless of her physical condition. Cassie accepted this with grim resignation. She had gambled everything and lost. This was the price. On October 10, 1907, Cassie Chadwick died in her cell. The official cause was heart failure, but the truth was more complex. She had died from the accumulated weight of her deceptions, from the stress of maintaining an impossible lie, from the crushing disappointment of being caught just when she thought she had won. Dr. Chadwick, who had divorced her during the trial, paid for a simple funeral. A handful of people attended, some former servants, a few curiosity seekers, and one woman who had been Cassie's cellmate. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a Cleveland cemetery, her real name, Elizabeth Bigley, on the death certificate. In the years that followed, Cassie's story became legend. She was remembered as the woman who fooled the world's richest bankers, who lived like a queen on borrowed money, who exposed the hypocrisy of Gilded Age society. Some saw her as a criminal, pure and simple. Others viewed her as a kind of folk hero. Still others recognized her as something more complex, a product of her time, a woman who had internalized society's values so completely that she destroyed herself trying to achieve them. Her final letter, found among her possessions after her death, was addressed to no one in particular. It contained a single paragraph: I wanted to matter. I wanted to be seen and heard and respected. I wanted to prove that a woman born to nothing could rise to everything. I succeeded for a time, and that success was glorious. The price was high, but I paid it willingly. I have no regrets, only the sadness of knowing that in a different world, with different rules, I might have achieved the same heights without the lies. But that world did not exist, and so I created my own. Cassie Chadwick's story endures because it asks questions that remain relevant more than a century later. What is the difference between legitimate and illegitimate wealth? How much of success is performance, and how much is substance? What do we owe to the truth, and what do we owe to our own ambitions? Whether one sees her as villain or victim, her life remains a testament to the dangerous allure of wealth, the fragility of identity, and the terrible price of ambition unmoored from truth.